1,500 years. I mean, just think about that number for a second. It took 1,500 years for the population of Rome to recover to its peak after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The devastation was so total, so absolute, that a booming city of 1 million people became a literal ghost town. And it didn't hit that 1 million mark again until the 1930s. Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're conducting an imperial autopsy on one of history's most fascinating and devastating economic collapses. We're going to unpack the economic rise and fall of ancient Rome to figure out exactly how the walls caved in on this legendary civilization. At its peak during the Pax Romana, Rome boasted 1 million inhabitants and controlled roughly 20% of the entire world's population. But fast forward to 1527 AD, and it was practically a ghost town with barely 10,000 people left. So instead of walking through a traditional agenda today, we're just going to launch right into this mystery. How on earth does a civilization this powerful, this vast, crumble from an era of unimaginable peace and prosperity into plague, foreign invasion, and a primitive barter economy?
Chapter 1. Building the Roman Engine.
To really understand the fall, we have to start at the very beginning. Back in 753 BC, Rome was founded as this tiny, unassuming village along the Tiber River. At that point, 90% of the population lived out in the countryside. The true backbone of the early Roman economy was just your small, self-sustaining family farmer tilling the land alongside their family. But as you'll see, this early republic stands in massive contrast to late Rome, which morphed into an economy dominated by huge, wealthy estates worked almost entirely by slaves. So how did they get from point A to point B? Well, everything shifted in 1460 BC. This year was the ultimate wealth catalyst. Rome finally defeated its main rival, Carthage, in the Third Punic War, and with that military victory came total economic domination. Literally overnight, Rome controlled incredible new trade routes, including access to the famous Silk Road. They're suddenly importing silk from China, spices and cotton from India, and ivory from northern Africa. Plus, conquering the Iberian Peninsula unlocked these massive, highly lucrative silver mines in Spain. So Rome is exporting everyday commodities like grain, wine, and olive oil, and bringing in unimaginable, exotic luxury. Which brings us to Chapter 2, the Pax Romana economy. All this massive influx of wealth ushered in a 200-year golden age, right from 27 BC to 180 AD, defined by internal peace, unprecedented territorial expansion, and extreme economic growth. Now, it's really important to note a major difference between ancient economies and ours today. Back then, militaries were massive economic engines. War was actually highly profitable. Conquering new lands meant direct plunder, fresh arable land for farming, tributes paid straight to Rome, and a huge influx of captured slaves. And the Roman army? When they weren't fighting, they weren't just kicking back. They were doing the grueling hard labor to build the roads, the forts, and the aqueducts that, in turn, fueled even more commerce. The results of this military and economic engine were absolutely astounding. The empire reached its peak territorial size in 117 AD, and thanks to all that wealth and infrastructure, Rome achieved something totally unprecedented. 1 million. They became the first city in all of human history to hit 1 million inhabitants. Its citizens were experiencing a level of everyday prosperity that the world had quite literally never seen before. Chapter 3, Wealth, Welfare, and Bureaucracy. Okay, let's slow down for a second, because right beneath the surface of all that prosperity, things were already beginning to fracture. If you looked closely under the hood of this economic engine, the warning lights were definitely flashing. A systemic rot was slowly taking hold. Remember those small family farmers we talked about earlier? Well, as Rome expanded, an estimated 10 to 20% of their entire population became slaves. This massive influx of slave labor sparked the rise of the Latifundia. These were huge estates owned by wealthy Romans worked entirely by slaves, churning out surplus crops for commercial sale. And the everyday small Roman farmers just couldn't compete with free labor. They lost their land, packed up, and were forced to migrate into the city, which suddenly created a massive, landless, and very poor urban class. And this brilliantly illustrates how the government reacted to this massive influx of unemployed citizens. They basically instituted one of history's first and largest state-run social welfare systems. By 123 BC, they started subsidizing grain. By 58 BC, that grain dole was completely free. They were handing out free food to over 300,000 men. That is 30% of the entire city relying on the state just to eat. The emperors knew they absolutely had to provide this, along with lavish gladiatorial games, mostly just to prevent widespread famine and massive civil unrest. But to manage this huge growing burden, the Roman economy had to fundamentally transform into a system of intense central planning. The government increasingly took control over how resources were allocated. You see a steep rise in state-controlled industries, strict price controls, and, naturally, sky-high taxation to pay for the whole shebang. Everyday folks, butchers, bakers, ironworkers, were suddenly crushed by intense regulations. The administrative costs became astronomical. It's crazy, but in some large towns, the state bureaucracy grew so big that it actually employed 50% of the population. As you can imagine, this heavy burden led to a severe drop in everyday economic productivity.
Moving to Chapter 4, Plagues and Extreme Inflation.
So the foundation is definitely cracking. But if the bureaucracy and the welfare state were the underlying conditions, what we're about to look at are the fatal blows that finally flatlined the Roman economy. Around 64 AD, Emperor Nero desperately needed more funds to cover rising costs, like building his massive golden palace. But he knew that raising taxes would make him incredibly unpopular. So he turned to a little trick called coin clipping. Here's how it worked, step by step. The state collects the citizens' coins, melts them down, and reissues a larger supply of new coins that looked identical but actually had less real gold or silver inside. The government then spent this newly created surplus to fund its massive projects without officially raising a single tax. A real game changer, right? Well, the devastating reality was that it secretly, but severely, reduced the real wages of everyday workers. It was a disastrous slippery slope, and late Roman emperors started relying on it heavily. As if all that financial rot wasn't enough, total disaster struck from the natural world. From 165 to 180 AD, the Antonine Plague just ravaged the empire. It wiped out an estimated 5 to 10 million people. That is a 10% chunk of the entire empire's population completely gone. The plague had a terrifying 25% fatality rate, and it absolutely crippled the Roman military and the economy. Facing a massive troop shortage and a plummeting birth rate, Emperor Marcus Aurelius was literally forced to enroll slaves, gladiators, and even criminals just to replace the army's ranks. And unfortunately, it didn't end there. Just 70 years later, the plague of Cyprian hit. At the absolute worst of the outbreak, 5,000 people were dying every single day in the city of Rome alone. Think about that scale for a second. Alexandria, the empire's second largest city, saw its population plummet from 500,000 down to just 190,000. Across the empire, thousands of small farms were completely abandoned because there was simply no one left alive to work them. Desperate people just began fleeing the cities, searching for empty plots of land in the country to try and become self-sufficient again. So picture this. The population is decimated, the tax base is collapsing, and military costs are soaring to defend these massive borders. Late Roman emperors completely panicked. They started minting millions of those clipped coins in a desperate, frantic effort to spend their way out of the crisis. Just look at how fast this snowballed. In early Rome, a silver coin was nearly 100% silver. By 250 AD, that dropped to 50%, and by 275 AD, just 25 years later, they contained less than 5% silver. So the crucial point is this. They completely flooded their own economy with virtually worthless currency. This rapid, out-of-control debasement triggered extreme hyperinflation that utterly destroyed whatever was left of their economic stability. All of this tension culminated in the absolute chaos we now call the crisis of the 3rd century. 26. In a span of just 50 years, Rome cycled through 26 different emperors. It was a devastating era defined by continuous civil war, total economic freefall, and foreign invasions. The once stable core of the Western world was violently ripping itself apart. Which leads us to Chapter 5, the postmortem and lessons. Whenever you hear about the fall of Rome, you almost always hear about the barbarians breaching the gates, right? But as this autopsy reveals, by the time the barbarians actually showed up, the game was basically already over. The empire had already hollowed out and fallen apart from the inside. The capital had moved east to Constantinople, long-distance trade had completely collapsed, and Western Europe was already fracturing into a localized feudal system. Now, even though ancient Rome's economy was vastly different from ours today, the findings of this autopsy leave us with some truly timeless economic principles. A thriving economy absolutely requires internal stability. It relies on allowing the free and open flow of commerce. And perhaps most starkly, this history screams a warning to us about the catastrophic dangers of out-of-control government spending, rapid currency debasement, and hyperinflation. Because when the fundamental value of money is destroyed, the entire civilization ends up paying the price. So we'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the most powerful empire in human history, a civilization that built wonders and controlled a fifth of the globe, could literally regulate, heavily tax, and inflate itself to total ruin, what does that mean for economies today? It is a fascinating question, isn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in our next deep dive into the forces that shape our world.